Okay, so who am I? I'm somebody who's just finished their PhD. I'm now an independent consultant, which means I'm looking for ways to use my PhD in the real world. My PhD was in complexity science and mathematics, and specifically I looked at agent-based models. So what we just did was create an agent-based model. My talk title is a bit of a BuzzFeed ripoff. What we're really going to do today is learn a bit about what agent-based models are and why they're interesting. So I'm not going to promise to give you 5 things you can implement, but I'm going to give you a way of thinking about things that might be a stepping stone to being something useful. And there'll be different reasons for being useful for different people. So my department was complexity science, that's why it's from complexity scientists. So this is an overview of my talk. I'm going to explain what complexity science is. I'm going to explain what agent-based models are. I'm going to say, where do agent-based models fit into a world of data analysis or data science? So my view is that it's a kind of data science. And I'll show that in a few slides. I'll give some examples of agent-based models, and I'll say, okay, if we had a bit of data, what else could we do? And I'll say, some take-home ideas rather than key things that we implement. So what is the world of data science? So for the people at the back, green is agent-based modeling, red is predictive analytics, and blue is data mining. And I think this is fair because data mining typically looks about the past and says, we understand what's happened in the past. Predictive analytics doesn't need quite as much data and says something about the future. And really the benefit to agent-based modeling over here on the left is that you don't need a lot of data to do it. What you do need is some understanding of the dynamics, which was this stuff in black here, which is the rules that the modeler follows, which is your update rules. So that's kind of why it's cool. We can come back to that later if people have questions of what fits into these things, because all 3 areas are interesting. And really, red and blue, predictive analytics and data mining, are kind of one thing, but for the purpose of this, it's not nice to separate them out. So why would anyone do agent-based models? Well, before that, I'll put my only joke on the slide in, and that's, here be dragons in the future. You can't make models that are purely predictive about 5 years into the future, 3 years into the future. So I'm not a futurologist. That's the only joke on the slide. So let's hope I'm done with it. Why would we do agent-based models? Well, if we subscribe to a view that Eastern philosophy is good or true, or both true and not true at the same time, that was a joke in my talk, then we understand that connectedness is important. We're not individuals. No man is not. Complexity, in the context of my talk, means systems where you have lots of interacting individuals or agents. So we were a version of that. There was lots of us and we were interacting. Complexity science is using tools from maths, computing and physics to understand these things. And actually, agent-based models just happens to be a tool within that area of science. It's used in sociology, computer science, game theory, ecology, biology, physics. So it's a tool that's used in many different areas. But for my PhD and for the models that I'm talking about, it's looking at very simple models that capture something from social science or social dynamics. And that's why we do it. I don't really need to tell you this slide because you've already had a go at doing it. Agent-based models are made up of agents, the interactions, and the connectivity. What kind of questions can we ask using these agent-based models? Well, if you were in a department studying diseases, you'd ask, how quickly is a disease going to spread? Is it going to get to a certain number and then die out? Are people going to click? Are they going to purchase? Are they going to sign up? Are they going to act? And all of these models depend on what your agents are, what your interactions are, and what your connectivity is. So the examples that I'm about to show in the next few slides essentially are variations on these three things. So we did a version of this. A simple contagion is one where the interaction is between two agents. So a simple contagion would be the guy in the middle looks at one friend and goes, oh, he's red, and changes. A complex contagion is where it's not like a disease where you catch it off one person, it might be behaviour. So you have to look at more than one friend. So a complex contagion might be this guy looks at all 6 of his friends, and 2 out of 6 of his friends are exhibiting certain behaviour. Now maybe in that model it's enough, and he starts exhibiting that behaviour as well. So there's different kinds of update rules, and they give rise to different dynamics. So the simplest interaction rules are copying your neighbours. So we did that. We've had a go at that. This is based on social science research. So, for example, the conformity experiments by Ash back in the 50s, where you had a room and one participant was persuaded to change their mind about different line lengths and comparing them to a reference line. And even though the group around them were lying, they would conform. So somehow there was a conformity that was taking place, even though the other members in their group were saying, okay, this line is the same length as something that's wrong. So we do it. As humans, we conform to a group. A nice other interaction rule that's a bit more complicated is the idea of homophily. And that's the idea that I hang out with people who are already like me. So there are models that incorporate this specific aspect of interaction. The voter model is one of the simplest agent-based models, and that's kind of similar to what we did. And it only incorporates social influence where you copy a neighbour. The Axelrod model, which was created back in 1997, captures both of these two interaction rules. So agents who are more similar are more likely to have an interaction, and this is an implementation of the rule of homophily. The Epstein model, which I won't go into detail here, you might want to have a look at maybe on NetLogo or something like this, is actually a model that's got enough features in that it captures whether or not you get a revolution. So you have police and you have agents and they can be sent to prison. It's kind of cool. What I did for my PhD was a voter model with some confidence in, and I found some stuff. So we were a bit like a lattice. The reason that social scientists use lattices for some of their models is because physicists used to. And the reason that physicists used to is that these models are simple enough that they could also capture the dynamics of magnets. So that's where some of the models came from, is that you actually say, this is a model of a magnet, and these are spins in the magnet doing different things. And again, we've done all this, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay, let's talk about some nice examples. What about, rather than just standing in the room and having our structure of who we're friends with, we could move around. What if we had a model where the agents were different? You have 2 colours, red and blue. You have some gaps that they can move to, and they have a parameter that describes their preference to be with people of the same colour, red or blue. Schelling found that if this preference to be with people who are similar to you was just really small, once you run the simulation, which is what we did, simulation of the dynamics, you do get segregation across the whole system. And this is what agent-based models are trying to do, is they're saying, if we know something about the local interactions, what can we understand about the global behaviour? And this model is brilliant, because it just captures something simple and then answers the question on a global scale. Can't believe there's no question. Okay, so our network structure was pretty simple. It was kind of like a lattice. Now we know that people don't all have 4 friends and books and all that structure. What about some kind of social network? Duncan Watts over in the States used a certain kind of network that looked a bit like a social network. And this was a scale-free network where you have some people with loads of friends, but most people with just a few friends. In fact, the number of friends, if you wrote them all out, there was no one characteristic one. Some people had loads, and some people had few, but there was every number in between. So it's kind of, there's nothing special about one particular number of friends. So this is called a scale-free network, and he found that when he implemented a model that used the ideas coming out of Ash's work, which is the conformity experiment, he found that the ideas that people had would change throughout the network. Now the way they changed throughout the network was implementing an update rule that came out of Ash's work, which is that if enough people who are your friends change their mind, you will follow the conformity rule and change your mind as well. So as a result, you get cascades of these conforming people, and he studied 2 kinds of networks. The scale-free one, which was kind of like a social network, and one where you're just friends with random people. And he did what we did. He timed the experiment and said, how long does it take before you get a cascade across the whole system? And not only did he time it, but he looked to see how big the cascades were. And he found that the network that the model was on made a difference for how big these cascades of behaviour were. So with scale-free networks, you get cascades where everybody changed their mind, which is what we got in our experiment. But with a random network, the cascade would stop after a certain point. So this is just a theoretical model that captures something from the real world, which is this conformity idea. And as a scientist, he studied 2 different networks and said, okay, it makes a difference.
Which one's,
oh, brilliant, yes.
Which one's Facebook more like, a scale-free network or a randomised network?
More like a scale-free network,
And is that
but
different?
not exactly like a scale-free network, because there's something actually which is even more like Facebook, which is this kind of one. So at the back there's 3 lattice structures, which are the connectivity of who's friends with who. You've got an ordered one, and it just happens to be in a ring, but it's ordered like we had it. Everyone's got 4 friends. So this is boring. Random is the other one. But now there's a third one, which is a small world network, where it's like the ordered one, but in addition to everyone having the same number of friends, some people have got friends in Australia, some people have got friends in Austria. Somehow this is a bit more like a social network. But
Would you say Twitter's a bit more like the random one? Because it becomes less geographic and more kind of you make random bounces of different things.
my guess is yes. And I haven't seen this test, but I would like to see it. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So the nice thing about the work that Christakis and Fowler did over in the States was to look at how obesity spread through a group of people when they knew who was friends with who. So they had the network structure, they had how people changed, whether obesity was changing, and they could look at this over time. And the interesting thing is that actually the data that they used could have been due to social influence, but could have also been due to common traits that the individuals had. So one person becoming more obese and somebody else becoming more obese and them being friends could be due to social influence, but could also be because KFC moved in on the same street where they both live, so there could be an external influence, an environmental effect as well. Something that Damon Santola did quite recently, 2010, was to control the social network by asking the participants to log onto a screen, and through the screen, essentially it's like Facebook, they could see what their friends were doing in terms of health updates. And again, he asked a similar question to before, which was how quickly do the changes in behaviour spread to the network, depending on what the network is. So he found that the behaviour spread much faster when you had an ordered network than when you had a random network. And this supports the idea that the behaviours were some kind of complex contagion where you need more than one friend to persuade you to change, because the ordered network, you have friends who are friends of each other. So this is kind of nice. Is there somebody who could give me a 10-minute shout before the end?
When's it finished?
Yeah.
At the end of the session.
Cool.
There's a question.
Oh yeah, I love questions.
I appreciate this as a simplified model, but it doesn't seem to have any take account of the fact that different people might have different levels of influence. Everybody seems to have the same level of influence throughout the network.
I like what you're thinking, because that's exactly what I was thinking at the beginning of my PhD.
Okay.
And so I added confidence to opinion for each agent. So an agent had an opinion and the confidence they had in that opinion, which could change over time, but meant that the agents were different when they interacted. So if we have a conversation and you're red and I'm blue, maybe you're more confident than me, so you're more likely to persuade me. So I investigated this model and asked the same kind of questions. How quickly do the ideas spread? And it depended on what the network was, what the effect was. But overall, having more confident people kind of slowed down the process of reaching a room where everyone is the same colour. Because you end up with super confident people who never change their opinion. And then kind of in between, people vacillate, but these two guys are just never going to change their opinion.
So presumably, if you have a confident person who's changes from blue to red,
Then they're really
and
powerful.
their influence to change the others is greater.
Yeah. And the dynamics that my model followed was that if you were confident and red, you would stay red for the rest of the simulation. So you could have different ones where there are different rules and different things happening. So we had a question about real networks. Somebody who's worked at Google and Facebook has written a book. So I take what they say with a bit of a pinch of salt, because it's their prerogative to say networks are important. But given that my talk will conclude with the fact that networks are important, I might as well conclude his point. They make 2 points in their book. They say, if you want to get ideas to spread through a group, it's worth looking out for 2 things. The 2 things are different kinds of hubs. So hubs are agents who have a particular network structure around them. And the first kind of hub might be someone who adopts new ideas quickly, but doesn't have to have that many friends. And the second kind of hub could be someone who has loads of friends, but maybe is a bit more slow on the uptake. And the key thing to getting ideas to spread through a wide area of your network is to have kind of 2 of these kind of people close to each other. Because one person changes their mind, and then eventually this person does, but they're kind of like a broadcast. And maybe this is a bit more like a conversation. So there's just a few more models, and then I'll conclude. So as you were asking that question, I was thinking, what could I have done to my model that would have made the dynamics as interesting as what you were describing? And it would have been changing who's friends with who. This dynamic network influences how the ideas spread and how fast they spread. In fact, they can affect what kind of structures you end up with. So the idea of having a dynamic network makes sense because if I'm sick, I won't go to school. So I change my status, my agent changes his status, but I also change my network structure because the friends who I would have seen today, did I say school or work? School. The friends who I would have seen at work are no longer my friends for that day, so the network is co-evolved. So there's a couple of researchers. Yeah.
Would the network also change if you change your opinions?
Yes. So this network changes here because if your opinions are so different that you can never have a conversation, the rules in this model is you just cut the time. And so you can end up with different kinds of situations. So depending on the model starting point, you can either have a whole room of people who are all blue or all red as the end point of the simulation, or you could end up with one of these situations where there's a little pocket here who are physically separated from this pocket over here, but each little region has its own region of consensus. And that depends on the parameters you use when you set the model up. So that's an example of networks changing, but somehow this makes sense because networks do change. Because we're running out of time, I won't talk about this slide. And I'll talk briefly about some behavioural insights that are kind of a starting place for doing new models or thinking about how you could incorporate real data into these kinds of things. So there's been some research into how people access information from the web. And there's two contrasting arguments. One is because people can access many different ideas, they're open to many more different influences. But research has shown that, actually people sit in a smaller social bubble when they go to the internet for information. And it depends a bit on whether you go to social media or search. So if you're using search, you might be open to you might see a broader range of perspectives. But if your influence are coming from social media or email, you're actually living in a little bit of a bubble. So this is something that you could incorporate into an agent-based model and see what the influences might be. And then the last 3 points here are about behaviours. And essentially they're books that are kind of interesting. So in Hook, Ted Greenwald talks about the feedback loop that companies use in order to get you going back to Facebook or Twitter. And this is where you have a trigger, like an update from a friend. They've tagged your photo, an action, you do something, a reward, there's some kind of social reinforcement. And then there's a final trigger as a result of your own investment. So Dan O'Reilly calls this the IKEA effect, where if you build a wardrobe, you kind of love it a little bit more because you spent some time on it. So in this context, if you've uploaded a photo, if you upload a photo, then you're invested in the process. And you uploading a photo means other people can comment on it, and then that provides the next trigger. Dan O'Reilly's got some really interesting books, and as a slight sidestep to this, Redirect by Timothy Wilson is kind of a refreshing comment which is different, which says that we can look for social progress through individuals transforming their own lives by considering their own internal story. So Redirect is not supposed to be anything to do with agent-based models, but it's to do with behavioural insight, which I think says something about individuals improving their own outlook, and individuals are autonomous. So my view is not that we're machines that sit and click on Facebook. This is kind of proof that I'm a real human being. So I'm getting near to the end. I'm going to skip this slide. I'm going to summarise and then come back to the summary of data science. So in summary, agent-based models are kind of useful, and with a bit of data, they're actually very useful for understanding the world. the key things that are important are networks and the interactions. Now, how can we understand these? Well, there is a bunch of research out there from academia, but actually we can get some of these insights from looking at social media data. So, in conclusion, what I've talked about is the green blob, agent-based modelling. It's good because it tells us something about the future, but we don't need lots and lots of data, or even some data. We just need to understand human behaviours in order to build the model. However, the red blob and the blue blob are useful, and there are great ways that these kinds of data science can help each other. And I can talk a bit more about that after we've finished if people want me to.